Thomas Shelby, a name that conjures an image of a charismatic, brilliant, and brutally efficient gangster, a man who built a criminal empire from the smoke and rubble of post-war Birmingham. Millions around the world know the legend from the hit TV show Peaky Blinders. We have been seduced by the style, the swagger, and the dark romance of his world. But the truth is far grittier. The real Peaky Blinders were not the glamorous anti-heroes of the screen. They were a real, historical street gang, and their story is one of brutal poverty, savage violence, and a desperate struggle for power in one of the most violent cities in England. This Anatomy of Dread documentary will conduct a deep psychological autopsy on the real gangs that inspired the legend. We will separate the historical fact from the television fiction. We will dissect the minds of the men who ruled the streets with razors and fists, and uncover a world that was, in many ways, far more terrifying than anything the show depicted. Forget the fiction, it is time to meet the real Peaky Blinders. Our story does not begin with the charismatic Thomas Shelby in the 1920s. It begins decades earlier, in the brutal, unforgiving streets of late Victorian Birmingham. This was the industrial heart of the British Empire, a city of smoke, steel, and profound, grinding poverty. In the slums of Small Heath and Cheapside, thousands of people were crammed into back-to-back houses with no sanitation and little hope for a better life. Life was cheap, and violence was a common language. It was in this crucible of poverty and desperation that the first street gangs, known as slogging gangs, were formed. These were not sophisticated criminal empires. They were territorial armies of young, working-class men who fought with fists, boots, and their signature weapon, the heavy leather belt with a sharpened steel buckle. Their wars were over territory, over social status, and over the simple, brutal right to be feared in a world that had given them nothing. The original Peaky Blinders emerged from this culture in the 1890s, a generation before the TV show was set. They were not a single, unified family gang led by a brilliant strategist. They were a loose collection of street toughs, known for their distinctive and surprisingly stylish appearance. They wore tailored jackets, bell-bottom trousers, and their most iconic feature, the tweed flat cap, worn pulled down low over the forehead. This leads us to the most famous part of their legend, the razor blades sewn into the peaks of their caps, which they would use to slash their enemies' faces and blind them. It is a terrifying and unforgettable image. But is it true? From a psychological perspective, this is a perfect example of how a legend is created. The name Peaky Blinder most likely came from the practice of wearing the cap's peak, or peaky, pulled down, obscuring their vision, or blinding them to outsiders. The story of the razor blades, for which there is very little concrete historical evidence, was likely a piece of self-made propaganda. It was a terrifying rumor that the gangs themselves probably encouraged. It was a psychological weapon, a way to build a reputation so fearsome that their enemies might be defeated by dread alone, before a single punch was ever thrown. The anatomy of their power was not just in their physical violence, but in the terrifying stories they told about themselves. The image is iconic, a Birmingham street tough, his face shadowed by the peak of his flat cap, a glint of steel menacingly embedded within the razor cap. It's the very symbol of the Peaky Blinders, a detail so brutal and imaginative that it has cemented their place in popular culture. But what is the reality behind this terrifying weapon? As we delve deeper into the historical records, the evidence for widespread use of razor blades in their caps becomes surprisingly thin. Police archives from the era, while documenting the numerous assaults and violent acts committed by these gangs, rarely mention this specific method of attack. The weapons of choice were far more rudimentary: fists, heavy boots, brick ends, and most commonly belt buckles fashioned into crude knuckle dusters. From a psychological standpoint, the myth of the razor cap is far more potent than the reality. It speaks to a deeper human fascination with ingenuity and savagery. It paints a picture of a gang so ruthless and inventive that they weaponized an everyday item, turning a simple piece of clothing into a tool of extreme violence. This image is instantly memorable and perfectly encapsulates the fear and intimidation that the Peaky Blinders cultivated. Consider the power of suggestion. If a gang earns a reputation for such a gruesome tactic, even if the reality is less frequent, the fear it instills in their rivals and the general public is immense. It becomes a form of psychological warfare, a way to control the streets without necessarily having to draw a blade in every confrontation. The whispered threat, the mere possibility of that hidden razor, could be enough to deter enemies and enforce their dominance. So, while the historical evidence for the razor cap as a common weapon remains debated, its power as a myth is undeniable. It perfectly embodies the brutal creativity of the Birmingham underworld, and serves as a chilling reminder of the razor-edged existence these gangs carved out for themselves. But if the razor cap was more legend than literal weapon, then what truly fueled the Peaky Blinders' rise? What were the real tools of their trade, both physical and psychological? And if they weren't led by a brilliant strategic mastermind like Thomas Shelby, then who were the real figures who commanded these violent streets? The television show presents the Peaky Blinders as a single, powerful family, a criminal empire led by the brilliant and calculating Thomas Shelby. The historical reality was far more chaotic and, in many ways, more brutal. The real gangs of Birmingham were not a single, unified entity. They were a loose, ever-shifting network of neighborhood gangs and street toughs, and their leaders were not charismatic masterminds playing a long game of chess. They were ruthless, violent men, often just teenagers, fighting for survival and dominance. To find the real Thomas Shelby, we must look at figures like Billy Kimber. Kimber was a real and powerful Birmingham gangster, but he was not a Peaky Blinder. He was their rival and, for a time, the most powerful gangster in England. His empire was not built on illegal bookmaking, but on the control of racecourses across the country. He was a formidable and feared figure, but his story is one of a rival, not the hero of our tale. The men who actually led the gangs that were sometimes called the Peaky Blinders were figures like Harry Fowles, also known as Baby-Faced Harry, a man who was arrested at the age of 19 for murder, or Ernest Haynes, another young gang leader who was imprisoned for a violent assault. These were not men who sat in boardrooms planning complex business strategies. They were street-level thugs who led through charisma and, most importantly, through a reputation for extreme violence. Let's conduct a psychological autopsy on the mind of a real Birmingham gang leader. Their primary motivation was not wealth, at least not at first. It was about power, territory, and status in a world that had offered them none. In the brutal social hierarchy of the industrial slums, to be feared was to be respected. Violence was the only currency that mattered. Their criminal enterprises were not the sophisticated operations of the TV show. They consisted of illegal bookmaking, protection rackets, robbery, and brutal, often pointless, street battles with rival gangs. The dread they created was not the cold, calculated fear of a modern mafia. It was the hot, unpredictable terror of street-level violence. You could be assaulted for walking down the wrong street, for looking at someone the wrong way, or for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was not a war of minds. It was a war of fists, boots, and belts. So, where does the glamorous, intelligent, and tortured figure of Thomas Shelby come from? He is a work of fiction, a brilliant and romanticized amalgamation of these historical figures. The show's creator, Stephen Knight, took the raw, brutal reality of the Birmingham gangs, the style of the Peaky Blinders, the ambition of men like Billy Kimber, and the trauma of the First World War, and forged them into a single, compelling, but ultimately mythical, character. The real leaders of the Birmingham underworld were not tragic anti-heroes wrestling with their inner demons. They were violent, desperate men, products of a violent and desperate time. But the TV show hints at a larger truth. After the First World War, the nature of these gangs did begin to change. A new generation of men, brutalized by the horrors of the trenches, returned to Birmingham, and they brought with them a new level of organization, a new understanding of violence, and a new, more ruthless ambition. The age of the street tough was ending, and the age of the true organized gangster was about to begin. The original Peaky Blinders, the belt-buckle-wielding thugs of the 1890s, had largely faded from history by the turn of the century, their dominance broken by a combination of police crackdowns and rival gangs. But the world was on the verge of a cataclysm that would reshape societies, shatter a generation of men, and breed a new, more ruthless kind of ambition in the slums of Birmingham. That cataclysm was the Great War. In 1914, thousands of young men from cities like Birmingham, including former gang members, were sent to the trenches of France. They were promised glory and a swift victory. Instead, they were plunged into a hell of unimaginable scale. They lived in mud, surrounded by rats and the constant threat of death from machine guns, artillery, and poison gas. Let us conduct a psychological autopsy on the mind of a returning soldier in 1918. He was a man who had been systematically trained by the military to kill, to suppress his empathy, and to operate in a world of extreme violence. He had witnessed horrors that the human mind is not built to withstand. He was suffering from what was then called shell shock, a condition we now know as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. He He returned to a country that celebrated him as a hero, but which offered him no job, no support, and no way to process the profound trauma he carried within him. This is the critical ingredient that the television show Peaky Blinders uses as its psychological core. The character of Thomas Shelby is a man haunted by the war. His ambition and his ruthlessness are a direct result of the ghosts he carries from the trenches, and this part of the story is absolutely true. The men who returned to the Birmingham underworld after 1918 were not the same street toughs who had left. They were different. They were harder, colder, and far more ambitious. They had learned the arts of organization, of strategy, and of large-scale violence in the most brutal training ground imaginable. They had looked death in the face and survived. The petty squabbles over street corners that had defined the old gangs now seemed childish. They wanted more. They wanted real power. This is where the historical reality begins to align more closely with the fiction of the show. The post-war era saw the rise of a new, more sophisticated kind of gangster in Birmingham. These men, many of them war veterans, began to organize the illegal bookmaking rackets with military precision. They understood the power of intelligence, of bribery, and of instilling a cold, professional fear that was far more effective than the chaotic brawling of the past. So, while a single all-powerful family like the Shelbys may be a work of fiction, the spirit of the post-war Peaky Blinders is historically accurate. The trauma of the Great War was the crucible that burned away the old street gangs and forged a new, more dangerous criminal element. They were men who had been to hell and back, and they were determined to carve out a kingdom for themselves in a world that no longer made any sense. But their ambition would not go unchallenged. The old powers of the British criminal underworld were not about to surrender their territory without a fight. The post-war ambition of the Birmingham gangs needed a new, more lucrative enterprise than simple street-level rackets. They found it in the booming, cash-rich, and legally grey world of horse racing. In the 1920s, racecourses were the casinos of their day, places where fortunes were won and lost, and where thousands of pounds in cash changed hands at every race. Controlling the bookmakers at these events was the key to real criminal wealth and power. This is where the historical reality and the television show once again find a common bloody ground. The battle for the racecourses, known as the Racecourse Wars, was a real and incredibly violent chapter in the history of the British underworld. The Birmingham gangs, led by the formidable real-life figure of Billy Kimber, began to expand their territory, seeking to control the lucrative betting rings at tracks across the country. But this expansion put them on a direct collision course with the established criminal empires of London. The London underworld was not a collection of street toughs. It was a sophisticated and powerful network of gangs, most notably the gang led by the infamous London boss, Charles Darby Sabini. Let's conduct a psychological autopsy on this new kind of conflict. This was not the chaotic street brawling of the old slogging gangs. This was organized crime. It was a war fought for economic control. The violence was not random. It was a strategic tool of business. Gangs would arrive at a racecourse armed with hammers, knives, and even firearms, and would violently drive out the rival bookmakers, taking over their pitches and enforcing their own control. The battles were legendary for their brutality. The infamous Battle of Bath Racecourse saw Kimber's Birmingham boys engage in a bloody all-out war with Sabini's London crew. These were not festivities, these were savage encounters that left men maimed or dead. The TV show Peaky Blinders brilliantly captures the spirit of this conflict, with Thomas Shelby's war against the London gangs being a central plotline. But the reality was, in many ways, even more complex. The historical Billy Kimber was a powerful and feared leader, but he was not the undisputed king that the show sometimes portrays. He was one of several powerful players in a constantly shifting landscape of alliances and betrayals. For the men who fought in these wars, many of them veterans of the trenches, the violence of the racecourse was a strange and terrifying echo of the war they had just survived. It was a continuation of the chaos, a new kind of battlefield where the enemy was not a foreign army, but their own countrymen. This is the true, brutal heart of the Peaky Blinders story. They were a product of their time, born in the poverty of the industrial slums, forged in the fires of the Great War, and driven by a ruthless ambition to carve out a place for themselves in a world that had offered them nothing. They were not the romantic, tragic heroes of the screen. They were a real and terrifying force in the British underworld, a testament to the fact that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones that history itself creates. And so, the real history of the Peaky Blinders is revealed. It is not the story of a single, charismatic family, but a fragmented and brutal saga of poverty, street violence, and the transformative trauma of a global war. The historical Peaky Blinders were not the sophisticated whiskey-drinking anti-heroes of the screen. They were a symptom of a sick and desperate time, a product of the industrial filth and social decay of Victorian Birmingham. So why has the fictionalized version, the story of Thomas Shelby and his family, become such a global phenomenon? The answer lies in the anatomy of a modern myth. The television show Peaky Blinders is a masterpiece of historical alchemy. It takes the raw, ugly, and often unglamorous ingredients of real history and smelts them into a single, polished, and incredibly seductive narrative. Let us conduct our final psychological autopsy. The show's creator, Stephen Knight, understood a fundamental truth. We are not drawn to history, we are drawn to stories. He took the stylish name and the signature look of the original 1890s Peaky Blinders. He took the brutal ambition and the racecourse wars of the post-war gangs led by men like Billy Kimber, and he infused it all with the profound, collective trauma of the First World War, personified in the single, brilliant, and haunted figure of Thomas Shelby. He created a myth that feels more real than reality itself. The dread of the real Peaky Blinders was the dread of random, pointless street violence. The dread of the fictional Peaky Blinders is the far more compelling, romantic dread of a tragic hero, a man who uses his intelligence and his capacity for violence to protect his family, and carve out an empire in a world that has cast him aside. We are not watching a gangster. We are watching a dark, Byronic hero. This is the power of a great story. It takes the chaotic, often meaningless, violence of history and gives it a purpose, a meaning, a soul. The real Peaky Blinders have been largely forgotten, their names lost to the dusty archives of old police records, but the legend of Thomas Shelby and his family will likely endure for generations to come. And this is the final, unsettling lesson from our investigation. It teaches us that the most powerful force in history is not always the truth. Often it is the best story. The story of the Peaky Blinders is a chilling reminder of how easily the brutal reality of the past can be reshaped, romanticized, and sold back to us as entertainment. The real men who lived and died in those violent streets have been replaced by ghosts, by beautiful well-dressed phantoms who are far more charismatic, and far less real, than the brutal truth. And so, the final investigation is now passed to you. After dissecting the history and the fiction, what do you believe is the most powerful element of the Peaky Blinders myth? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the discussion about the line between historical truth and the powerful legends we create. Because the story of the Peaky Blinders teaches us that sometimes, the most successful lies are the ones that tell us a deeper truth about ourselves.